I'm running because I'm tired of the extreme partisanship that we're seeing in Congress. Politicians are so focused on themselves, they're not focused on the people's business. They're focusing on their party, they're putting their parties ahead of the nation, they're putting their personal ideologies ahead of the people, and they're not solving problems. And the country's in crisis, and we need to solve problems and work together with practical solutions. What you're going to hear today are very different views on the role of government. We're going to hear whether or not we want to help, the government should help make people's lives better, or should the government, and solve problems, or should the government simply impose, should an individual simply impose their rigid and extreme ideological views and have no government involvement whatsoever and leave everyone to themselves. I want to tell you a story briefly about Marvin Schur. Marvin Schur was 93 years old. He lived in Bay City. He froze to death because his utilities were shut off, his heat was shut off. He made several attempts to try and pay his bill. Everyone was outraged by that. The Michigan legislature took 5 bills to address that issue. My opponent here voted against every single one. In many cases, he was the only vote. This was a bipartisan effort. Over 83% of the Republican caucus voted in favor of these bills to prevent that type of occurrence from happening again. Real lives are affected by these policies. Real lives. This is not theory. This is the real world. Thank you.
Thanks, Pat.
Mr. Miles comes and criticizes me for these votes. These are votes I've explained. These are votes I've explained before. And he talks about hurting seniors. Well, I voted many times to protect seniors. And for example, there was a senior medical alert bill which I supported. There was a bill about obtaining fraudulent signatures from seniors, which I supported. There was a bill about allowing vulnerable adults, which includes seniors, to testify by video in a criminal case. I supported that bill and worked to amend it to improve it. There was a bill about increasing penalties for exploiting vulnerable adults, which includes seniors, and I supported that bill. And when we talk about these electric utility bills, there were bills I voted against. But you have to read the bills. And people aren't reading the bills. And I'm sure Mr. Miles has not read those bills and doesn't know what's in those bills. And so it's important to know what's in the bills. It's important to know what's in the bills before you criticize them. One example was there was a joint resolution recently to ask for a 72-hour review period before you vote on a bill. Well, Mr. Miles came the next day and said it was irresponsible to require our legislators to take 72 hours to review a bill before voting on it. Irresponsible. There's nothing irresponsible about that. Our citizens deserve the time to know what's in a bill. Our legislators need to know what's in those bills. Thank you.
Now, he says the reason he didn't vote against it was he didn't have time to read the bills. That's not the excuse that he put on his Facebook page. The excuse, he uses that excuse as a generic excuse when there's ever legislation he doesn't like. His real excuse on the Facebook page was he thought all of those bills was too much government interference, too much government regulation to protect seniors from being frozen in the winter. Yeah, it is irresponsible to wait, to deny that type of help when people's lives are at stake. It is irresponsible. On the deficit, very big problem that I'm very concerned about the spending. And so I'm saying that people in Congress need to live the way that families and businesses do. When you miss your budget, you take a hit. So I'm proposing a 5% congressional pay cut every year that the federal budget is in balance. Politicians talk a lot about thank you. Yeah. Politicians talk a big game about reining in spending, but they're playing with other people's money. They have no skin in the game. Let's have a consequence there. 5% pay cut. We need a presidential line item veto to cut waste and pork out of bloated congressional budgets. I support the Disclose Act, which requires some of these special interest groups that are funding these attack ads like we saw in the primary here against Senator Bill Hardeman. Mr. Amash opposes those types of requirements, where those donors to those groups need to be disclosed. That's transparency, folks. Who's funding these PAC ads? Who are the big money interests? Who are these big money interests that are standing behind these shadow groups to come in and affect your district? That's who we need to know. That's transparency. Let's get to the root of the problem, too much money in campaigns. Thank you. Mr. Amash has been endorsed by the Liberty Slate 2010. He's backed by the Club for Growth. They both, if you look into these organizations, support strongly candidates who want to phase out and or privatize Social Security. That was, and they have issued warnings. They signed a pledge with the Americans for Tax Reform and so forth. And these are groups that are really looking to try. And Paul Ryan's got a plan out there that has a partial privatization plan that he's embraced in a magazine article. So we really have to look at this. And I pledge I will never allow the privatization of Social Security. That is absolutely. Social Security is a baseline. It's what it is. It's supposed to be a safety net, and that's going to be something that we can't put in jeopardy. Well, I'm not getting notes from my campaign aide to help me with my answers, but at least they can be accurate. All right.
We've had congressmen like Vern Ehlers, a man of integrity, Paul Henry, Gerald Ford. That's what we need now. We don't need the extreme partisanship, misleading statements. I'll give you one example, and there are many examples. Mr. Miles has made many misleading and false statements today, but I'll give you one example.
You know, obviously my campaign theme from the get-go has been ending extreme partisanship. And one of the things that does bother me in terms of the partisanship in this election, I've heard continually, is when I talk about integrity of our past congressmen. They talk about Gerald Ford, they talk about Paul Henry and Vern Ehlers and Hal Sawyer. And those were men of integrity. They leave somebody out. Dick Vanderveen, who was also a man of integrity. And you know why they leave him out? For one reason, he was a Democrat. That's partisanship. That's partisanship, folks. Well, thank you. Again, we've got to end the extreme partisanship. We've got to have people who are willing to work together and solve problems and not stand on their personal ideology, sometimes standing alone when there are real problems happening and need to be solved. We didn't talk today about jobs and the economy, which is actually really the #1 issue that most voters are concerned about. I've put forward very specific proposals on that. As a business lawyer, small businesses are where the jobs are. They've created 64% of the net new job growth over the last 15 years. Just saying across-the-board tax cuts, that's not specific, that's platitudes. I'm talking very specifics on how we can help small businesses. First, they have access to capital need. We've got to help get funding to them through, there's a program coming through where there's money coming through that the states can help improve the balance sheets so that companies can borrow against that collateral. There hasn't been one default by Michigan Company on that. We need to have a temporary payroll tax holiday so that companies aren't punished for hiring and that workers can have more money to spend, because when workers have money, it goes right into the economy. We need to make sure that we have fair and reciprocal trade agreements, not free trade. China's been devaluing its currency to make their products very cheap here and make our products expensive there. That is a subsidy that China is giving to their companies there. We've got to look again, as I mentioned, the research and development tax credits. One of the things I also am proposing, I think this is going to be a really good stimulative effect, is accelerating the depreciation when a company buys American-made equipment or machinery, so that the company that's purchasing it has an incentive to buy it, gets a faster tax write-off, bigger tax deduction, and it is encouraging to buy American-made equipment and machinery. It's got to protect American jobs. In that regard, we've got to close the tax loophole that gives an incentive to send American jobs overseas. And so, but again, I really have a hard time understanding how any politician could vote against protecting the lives of constituents when lives are at stake. We're using an excuse of time, using an excuse of government ideology. We've got to protect our citizens, our seniors, our most vulnerable. That's a biblical, I'm a Christian, that is a biblical principle of protecting the least among us and our widows and our children. We have to do that. It's an imperative. Thank you.
How can we get West Michigan back to work when our companies are making their products in China? Don't ask Justin Amash. Justin co-owns a factory in China that manufactures the tools he sells in America, and he's repeatedly voted against jobs here in Michigan. Justin is not a fighter for American jobs, he's a creator of jobs in China. His Chinese factory, his policies, and his record are the proof.
I'm Pat Miles, and I approve this message because we need leaders who will fight for jobs here in West Michigan.